and thank you for joining us, as Molly says, on that lovely introduction. I'm delighted to be part of this Autism Acceptance Week, as always. And of course, things are much easier to accept when they're going smoothly and going well. I just had an experience yesterday in a restaurant with a little boy, and believe me, it was a lot easier to accept and understand at the start of the meal than he was at the finish. So today I'm going to be really sharing some strategies and ideas and thoughts that hopefully you might consider giving a go. And of course, like always, when I share a strategy, I sometimes am expecting people to be really flexible in their thinking. So for example, I'm going to be talking a little bit later, or now in fact, about using a traffic light system. And of course, people's immediate thought might be, oh, my little one's a bit young for that, or a little bit old for that, or they're academically beyond that, or they're not quite at that stage where it might be relevant. And of course, those kinds of strategies are so adaptable and so broad in their application that actually I've used them for a very, very young child to help him to remember to not just run out of the door, and to look at his little get ready sack, which is where his shoes were, so that he actually put his shoes on before he ran out of the door. And that worked great for him. But then for another young boy who actually was really struggling to meet his targets set at school, just for his homework and also for his submitting work online. So for him, he had a little stop sign on the calendar with a red ring around it when his assignment was set. And then a couple of weeks later, when his assignments were coming in to being due to hand in, he had a get ready, the little orange circles, onto the week before. And then on the actual day that he needed to submit his work was his green day. So these sorts of strategies are really flexible, and I think it's a big mistake for us to just dismiss something thinking, oh, well, you know, my person who is in my heart and mind isn't really up for that, or it's not really appropriate for them. And sometimes that's the sort of thing I hear when we talk about wanting to create success, and our starting point in that creation being that high five, that note of achievement, or that award. And many, many parents share with me that actually even just giving praise can be really tricky. And sometimes in terms of giving praise, we might need to be just thinking about, you know, putting a little thumbs up sticky note on the bedside table or on the fridge door. So I really want us to try and sort of put aside all those barriers that we've perhaps brought on board over the years, because we've tried that and it didn't work. And I've been there too. I've tried things and they didn't seem to work at that time. But actually, with a little bit of tweaking and a bit of changing, or creating a bit of novelty for those children who have got that more of a PDA profile of autism, that demand avoidance, where when even just asking them to do something can create a panic attack, and then we see that in behaviours. So if we can really create success, then I think it's a good idea to start with what Brené Brown talks as in her book Daring Greatly. And she talks about the importance of internalizing success. And she redefines the whole idea about success by saying it's so important that we integrate into success our vulnerability and our ability to seek support. And of course, for many of our children, that whole asking for help, you know, it might be we need to introduce a physical means of supporting them in asking for help, because verbalizing when help's needed in a time of crisis or distress can leave many of our children not really processing language so well, or not able to ask for that help in the way that we would prefer. So Brené Brown, in her book, she talks about success being about avoiding actually striving for perfection. And in fact, she talks about perfectionism can be very self-destructive and indeed even addictive. So perhaps to plan to set up for success, our first commitment really could be to think about how can we ensure that actually our children are feeling that success, that they are internalizing those moments of success. And of course, in order to do that, we've got to move into the arena of accommodation. And accommodating our children starts with us understanding their need. And you might be at this point be thinking, well, that's all well and good, but my child really, really does not cope well in whatever way I give him praise. And I too have had those children in my life, and they might shout, stop, go away, or simply shut down. But you know, if we offer praise of any sort, research actually really does reinforce and tell us, theorists, temperament theorists, way back in the 1990s, people like Gunnar and Rothbard, these psychologists explain that these differences are a range of thresholds, and it's based on the amount and type of arousal and the response that's been triggered in our children's brains, in that amygdala almond shape of part of the brain that responds to their fight and flight and freeze hormone, and that hypothalamus that really kind of governs lots of their holding on and recalling memory. So most interestingly, the areas of the brain identified as governing all of these fight and flight hormones and the feel-good hormones such as oxytocin and serotonin and dopamine, they're relevant in those feelings of pleasure, motivation, and reward. So for me, it kind of makes sense that often our children seem to have these big reactions, and so therefore they might have a big reaction to that whole arena of feeling praised and internalizing indeed themselves that feeling of success. And if you think of that in terms of sensory feedback, we think of a noise that we can't stand and how that noise sometimes sends shudders through your soul or sets your teeth on edge. Maybe it's nails down a blackboard or squeaky brakes. Everyone has got something that they find really hard to tolerate, and that it has such a response that it creates a physical reaction in their bodies. And I know comedian Sarah Gibbs talks about the fact that she's got thousands. For her, feet on gravel, sweeping, machinery, electricity. She says that her list is endless, and cutlery on plates. And I know the little boy I mentioned earlier, that was his big issue, that actually coping with people's noises, that sort of misophonia type of sensory to sensitivity to noise, for him is a real challenge. So thinking about how can we change that. And I know one family who actually for a little while just went to using non-metal cutlery until his tolerance levels were just at a better point and a better stage to cope. And of course, it's not as simple as just altering one thing. It's also working on how we can accommodate his tolerance as well. So providing him with things like ear defenders to wear at the table. And if, as with this young boy, the very idea of wearing ear defenders at the table didn't fit with him because they were something he associated with school. So we got a little pair of flare earbuds, and we called them munch mufflers, and put them in the cutlery drawer, and he was much more able to tolerate those and felt much more comfortable with those. So it's so important that we really learn to appreciate and to tune into what is really going on. And the likelihood is to do with difficulty in coping with those detailed and those intense feelings, like Sarah describes here. You know, we really can achieve some level of understanding from other people, from other autistic individuals who are sort of explaining to us that actually these experiences are overwhelming and they're accompanied with very physical feelings as well as an emotional response. So it's not that they're being awkward or difficult or rude, but that actually they're dealing with that internal response that is in fact very overwhelming. And we're likely to notice those other areas of development for many of our children. And it might be noticeable in ways in which they are seeking lots of social contact, whereas other children might be more sedentary in their activities and less sort of seeking of social contact. And as parents and carers, of course, this balance always brings us to a bit of a crossroads. And the crossroads is when we're really trying to think, well, how much can we accommodate? How much then do we need to accompany that with some coaching so that we can set our children off on that road to success? Because unfortunately, the reality of our world is that even at home and at school, if all we do all the time is accommodate, but we don't also equip with coping mechanisms, then the danger is that when our children are beyond the arms and the love and hearts and minds of our care and moving up into sort of broader experiences, then it's very difficult for them to sort of start and relearn some coping strategies. So the earlier we can get those on board, then the better that can be, because then they become habitual. Our children will be hopefully comfortably and automatically reaching for the things that they know that will help them to tolerate that moment, to achieve that exposure and also that inclusion of an activity that they perhaps want to be involved in. You know, the boy I've mentioned, you know, he wants to go out with the family, he wants to be part of that dining experience, but sometimes it's just overwhelming. And of course, the simple answer would be, as with many activities, well, let's just let him stay at home, or let's just all have takeaway. Let's just not go through that particular experience. But of course, sometimes that's not the answer. And I can't sort of sit here and say, this is how we must do things. What I can do is encourage you to look at not just the here and now, but also the bigger picture for our children. But of course, moving into that bigger picture, you know, that lovely picture here of the coloured worlds behind me in the office I'm using today, really reminds us that actually, you know, the world and our children are made up of those many, many different colours, and our situations and our energy levels and our personal circumstances come into play so much. So please don't ever feel that I'm sort of here on a pedestal saying these are the things you can do and this is what will happen. I know that actually all of this is a road and all of this is a journey, and our journeys will definitely be running smoothly sometimes, and sometimes we'll hit that pothole we didn't expect to see, and sometimes we'll scuff the you know, alloy trim on our wheels, and sometimes we'll be on that road to success and we didn't even anticipate that it was going to be so easy. So it is healthy and it's good for our children in the long term to experience all of those things, to sometimes feel a little bit off route, and then perhaps come back to feeling back on the road with that thumbs up or that reassuring high five. And I think, in truth, most of us would agree that for the well-being of our children and for the success of their futures, a little bit of coaching to support their tolerance could actually be a really positive turning point for them. And so sometimes that turn, that change, can be actually starting with us. And of course, as parents, we'll often sort of put our hands to our head and think, oh, it's all down to us, or, you know, it's all mum's fault again. But actually, sometimes just tweaking what we're doing, just thinking about how can we coach, how can we really help to understand and change the way in which we are communicating, you know, communicating in that very different way. And that, you know, those sweeties that carry a message sometimes, even they can be useful. And how can we coach? You know, an autistic 7-year-old recently was observing his ADHD younger brother. And he said to me, I used to be like that, but now I take a deep breath and I think, I'll be okay. And I just thought that's so lovely to hear that he actually is sharing one of the ways that he copes. And he showed me how he takes a deep breath by going up his thumb and down into his hand, and then up his finger and down into his other fingers, and so on, to take his deep breath. And of course, many of us have heard of common strategies like using first and then and now and next. And in fact, sometimes those strategies are the simplest ones that surprise us and take us on that road of success. But sometimes they need thinking out a little bit more. And I'm just going to pull up the title here of a book that I've recently come across, and it's called Declarative Language Handbook. And it's using a kind of different way of speaking to our children. And it's by a lady called Linda Murphy. And I really rate this book because for those children, especially that have got that profile where as soon as they hear their name, they know you're going to follow through with a request. And that doesn't just mean our autistic children with that PDA profile. That can be the case for many of our neurodiverse children. For our ADHD children, our children with complex processing, language, and processing what they're hearing and then converting that into meaningful, purposeful, reciprocal language. Our children who don't necessarily initiate conversation. And I was observing an 11-year-old recently, and I noticed that actually I would say 90% of his communication is responsive, and he's not doing the promoting communication, he's not triggering communication, he's doing a lot of responding. So this book is kind of using a more declarative way of speaking, and it really is what it says on the tin. We could get very bogged down with all the complexities of it, but the reality is, instead of asking something or directing a question or a request towards somebody, we're declaring the moment, declaring the situation. Oh, I noticed that the dog's looking hungry. Rather than whoever's in the house, it's the responsibility to feed the dog. You haven't fed the dog, go and feed the dog. Or, oh, I notice it's getting to school ready time and not all the bags are packed. So that we're kind of offering that opener, offering that opportunity for our children to process what needs to be done and then actually acting on it. And of course, that's a really nice seed to set and plant for problem solving in a really comfortable way. So changing our language, using that declarative way of speaking for many of our children can be really helpful. And some of you might be there saying, you're joking, aren't you? Unless my language is very direct and maybe even in a way where I'm using a schedule that's very spelt out, and it might be even more spelt out. So it might be, you know, we get to the library and we need even more details of what's going to happen in the library, that we're going to be getting 2 books and they're going to go in our zip pocket. And of course, that's about us really being detectives and understanding our own children's profile. And I often think, you know, when we see things like this, we see things like classroom rules, and we look at those rules and think they are rules telling our children how we expect things to go. And we might have a similar thing at home. But in reality, our children are carrying their own rules. And I often think, I wonder what their rules look like. And, you know, does their rule look like, I need a way of getting out of here? I need to know where I can exit. Do they look like, I need to know what will help me to have a better day. What can I take along with me? And I did a bit of a chat box curiosity, and I love that. You know, when you ask the AI chat, so Copilot, and back in March, I sort of just did a little bit of research on what does chatbots tell us about things like classically we understand are associated with our neurodiverse children. So we often talk about the skills of our neurodiverse children. And I think if we can link into those skills, then they can be the absolute root of success, the absolute root of internalizing success and understanding success. And I had a really interesting night-night conversation with an 8-year-old recently, and he jumped onto the bed and said to me, I'm autistic, Nanny. And I said, yes, I've heard that's the case. And he shared with me that it meant that actually some things he finds a bit hard, but the things that he is good at are things like noticing detail and thinking of games and doing his Lego quicker and building his Lego models much more quickly and much more creatively than lots of his peers. And I just love that, you know, hearing that real positive conversation, but also that self-knowledge that actually this is who I am, and this is how I am, and this is how I roll. And of course, you know, life isn't always that smooth, and it's great to embrace those moments. So let's have a look at what chatbot told us. So that attention to detail, that many individuals with autism have that exceptional attention to detail. I think we can agree with that. And that actually that is something that is advantageous in lots of jobs, in lots of play activities, in lots of school tasks, and really important that we tune into that. So what about memory and recall? Well, lots of autistic people have that remarkable memory and ability to recall detail of things with real precision. And of course, one of the things that I've, in my experience, seen and noticed is that sometimes revisiting a situation for autistic children can be very challenging because they actually re-feel it and re-experience it. And so perhaps something that's happened, if a child got stuck on something and found it difficult to achieve a task, then the memory of that can then become a barrier to them wanting to move on, because that precise and really felt intense memory. So how can we move them on from that? And I think this is where, again, we can fall back on some of the kind of old stay-hearts. We can take our pictures, we can help them to see what we're saying. So collect lots of evidence of when your child is enjoying something, when they're succeeding at something. How often do we think to take a photograph of them building their Lego, or just playing on the trampoline, or, you know, running in the park, doing the very regular things that we know that they can enjoy and succeed at? But these can be used as evidence then. Remember when you started that task, how hard it is. Here's the evidence that you achieved this before, and we can do it again. So really, really tuning into that important skill of helping our children always to see what we're saying. We know that using just verbal language for many of our children is way too little, really. It's too little investment for their way in which their brain works and decodes the world. And when we think of that detail, we think here of, often we jump to the conclusion of the fact that many of our children are great at maths and numbers. And of course, it's not always the case at all. And I think this is a danger when we go on something like ChatGPT and Copilot, and the information is very categoric. The information can be sometimes, therefore, a little bit misleading. Here we have, you know, their analytical skills can be valuable in problem solving. Absolutely they can. And scientific endeavors. But that's not to say that all our children will want to be scientists. Our children thrive on routines and structure, which can lead to efficient planning and execution. Well, yes, for some. For some children, routines and structure can actually lead to a bit of a kind of, barrier in terms of them hitting against that, or being very anti-routine and anti-structure. And those are the children that we need to engage with, that vast creativity that's mentioned here, and that sort of artistic way of going about something and being more creative. And sometimes that's where it's very difficult for parents to and carers and teachers and professionals, anyone, to recreate a strategy. And it can be very tiring to sort of change that and recreate that. And I want to just draw your attention, before I do move on this particular slide, to the fact that actually this savant skill that is sometimes mentioned in relation to our children is actually more about really understanding that sometimes our profile in our children is very spiky. So we see that real success in one area, but then a real challenge in another area. And actually, it's only around a small percentage of people in the population, in the autistic population and the general population, that have that real sort of savant skill that we do talk about. And of course, people that do have those exceptional skills are worth drawing on. It's often the case that we can find someone who's related or connected to our child's interest that we can use to demonstrate how they've managed to achieve by using their own autistic profiles. So I often, if I'm working with a child perhaps who's into their drawing, I might Google, for an artist and come up with someone. I was showing somebody recently online the wonderful detailed drawings that Stephen Wiltshire did on the Houses of Parliament and such like. And I was actually in the United States at the time, and I was showing some drawings that he'd done in the United States. So using people out there is a really good thing, useful thing that we can, a useful resource that we can draw on. And of course, as Janine Booth, an autistic lady, reminds us, that many of today's autistic adults were in fact undiagnosed autistic children and did not get the support and self-knowledge that comes with diagnosis until later in life. And of course, I know, you know, the difficulty that some of you may be experiencing in terms of going through that diagnostic process. But I think what is worth engaging in is, whether your child has got a diagnosis or not, is engaging in their profile, helping them to know what they are good at and to use it. And this picture of a Smartie cookie is just something that I often use when I'm working directly with young people. We designate each Smartie to kind of the areas here. So we talk about, well, how good are we at like noticing detail? How good are we at remembering things? What particular areas are our skills in? And so we identify those in terms of the Smartie colours, and then we put them on a Smartie cookie to remind ourselves what smart cookies we are. So just a really kind of nice, light-hearted way of remembering that we can use lots of different ways of helping our children to see what we're saying. And of course, all of this leads to success. And when you think about seeing what we're saying, I think there's a danger that we think in terms of using more young or childlike types of cards and pictures and ways of working. And I was recently in a hospital, and noticed this particular picture and thought, yeah, you know, look how simple this is for everyone who's coming in for a procedure to know what's expected, what needs to be removed and what can be left in situ. And so we know from the slide I've just looked at that actually many of our kids are great at remembering things, that their communication system is often more attuned to visual memory, so that detail. And you know, often our children will be less inclined to remember verbal or social instructions. So we just need to raise our own knowledge and raise our own intention and commitment, so that we make it appropriate and usable and comfortable for everybody. And the other thing this picture does is remind us that actually this did not do any harm to anyone else in the hospital. So irrespective of their IQ, of their academic ability, of their needs, everybody can access pictures, everybody can access these visual ways of communicating. And again, I think a bit like the traffic light strategy, there's always a danger when we're talking in terms of accessing support in a visual way, that we dismiss the relevance and we dismiss the potential success that it can actually really root and fuel for us. I am sharing with you now a strategy that a mum who I was working with very recently shared with me, and she had discovered that actually her son's love of balloons was a really great sort of pathway and route into supporting his communication and understanding skills much better. And actually using this kind of teaching, it might be you know, using activities like using dye in on fabric and drawing with fabric dye, you know, rather than writing. So, you know, using balloons to write on, using fabric to write on. It doesn't matter what source we use. It doesn't have to be laminated photographs, pictures, downloads. It just needs to be something that's meaningful to our particular child. And then hopefully sharing that discovery with school, and hopefully school are open to that. Unfortunately, sometimes we meet barriers there that perhaps are rooted in policy and historical practice, rather than a reality of revisiting and being more open to situations. And I know one particular mum, not necessarily this mum, who wanted to introduce a kind of similar thing in school that she'd been doing at home, and school were very reluctant because they'd had I think many decades ago a situation where a balloon had popped and upset a child or been too close to their face. And of course sometimes it's about encouraging even, you know, the most important elements of life to be re-examined and revisited. And whilst our policies are in there for safeguarding and for protection, and sometimes many people feel like their hands are tied with these policies, so you can't possibly have balloons in class. So again, I really encourage people to just revisit that and rethink, why are we truly saying this? And sometimes it can be from fear that that's what everybody will want, or everybody will get a little bit overexcited with this strategy. And I was talking to 2 teachers just this week, and both of them were saying that in their experience, allowing the autistic child in their class to have that little bit more flexibility did not have a negative impact on the rest of the children, because actually the rest of the children are set differently. their desire to please in a different way. Their skills lay in a different area, in a different arena. So just being more fluid and more flexible in our thinking can be another really good route to setting our children up for success. And accepting that all of our kids have got a different way of working, a different way of understanding, and different needs in terms of how we approach things and how we work with things. So going back to that early slide, thinking in terms of Brené Brown, can you imagine how lovely it is for this little person to internalize that he now knows, oh, he's pre-warned, he's set up for the fact that it's wakey time, or that it's approaching sleep time. And for many of our children that don't carry those internal pieces of knowledge, must be really alarming sometimes to be absolutely in the thick of your play and suddenly it's nighttime or it's going dark. And I think sometimes when we are perhaps working from a less particularly purely autistic way of thinking, that we sometimes put on our neurotypical interpretation about how things will A, be received, and B, have an impact. And I know I have worked in school where there's been a lot of worry around having things like a listening stick and a speaking stick available. And actually that little strategy in school helped for a little girl who was so keen to be involved and so enthusiastic and so contributed so much to the classroom that she was actually then left to feel very uncomfortable because she was getting into a lot of trouble. And then her response to being asked not to ask so many questions was to not ask any at all. And of course, for many of our children, this is the difficulty when we're introducing strategies, that we don't want to tip the scales to weigh the other way. So by having a little listening stick and speaking stick, it meant that a teacher could just quietly turn that over for her when it was an okay time for her to contribute and to have something to say or a question to ask. So it's really thinking in terms of how can we make little changes in our approach, in what we're doing, and in our communication. So we're not talking, three kind of thoughts there, which are not rocket science. It's not new research. It's not new information. It's just a real encouragement to think about that road to success. What are we doing in terms of understanding our child's profile and helping them in terms of accommodating that profile, but then also coaching them so that they can feel comfortable and feel encouraged and enabled to participate, and start to use strategies themselves that they know and that they are comfortable with. And at Christmas this year, a lovely discovery just from a very simple little puppet, that actually celebrating success and accepting praise for this particular young man was a very difficult hurdle, and something that really everybody had backed off doing because of the reactive response that you would get in even just telling him that good job or showing him a thumbs up. And he actually discovered or exposed himself that actually accidentally telling himself that he did a great job, and he used the puppet to say, hey, good job, well done. And sometimes that kind of second element, I'm a great advocate for puppets for helping our children with communication. And they're never too old. Famous puppeteers that make their living from using puppets, are not all children under the age of 10 or children under the age of 6. There are adults out there that have made successful careers. So again, one of my kind of real sort of seeds for thought today is around thinking and revisiting some of those toys or activities that you've perhaps put away because you think, you know, they're getting a bit too old for that now. I think it's a real mistake for us to make that assumption. And, you know, just explore, be brave, pull them out. A lot of you are probably still in the middle of school holidays. You know, brave getting the Play-Doh out again. What's the to lose? Brave mixing a bit of corn flour with some water and dripping some coloured dye in it. A great way of doing your homework if you've got to do some writing or some artwork, and setting yourself up to be relaxed before you actually do that. And then, of course, one of the other sort of seeds for success is to be really thinking what might happen that I haven't prepared my child for. So what is the possible thing that could go wrong here? What might be the hiccups in what's going on? So just sort of thinking things through before it's the actual moment in time, so that our children don't end up being the ones at the swimming pool without the spare t-shirt and that sort of thing, that actually we've thought ahead. And I'm not saying pack the bag for them, but I'm saying, what can we do? Can we put a traffic light on their bedroom door that's got a red traffic light saying, these are the things we need for today? And then that traffic light changes to orange on by the shoe cupboard. These are the things that we need for today. And then the green is the go, have we got the things that we need for today? So rather than just showing our child once, we're actually giving them 3 comfortable opportunities there to just check and recheck. Because sometimes when we've got that schedule hung up in one place, it might not be so convenient to just go back and check. So just having things available and convenient and repeated can be really helpful in terms of supporting our children in succeeding. So let's just have a little recap. So first of all, we started off thinking about how can we support our children in being set up for success? How can we help them to internalize the positive skills and knowledge about themselves? How can they be that child that actually knows what they're good at and can maybe even verbalize that? How can they be that child that knows the things that they find difficult and what they can pick up to take with them to prepare for that? Do they need their ear defenders? Do they need their key ring with their schedule on it? Do they need their sunglasses? So just revisiting some of the things that have perhaps got old and shabby and feel a bit worn out, or you visited them 4 or 5 years ago and don't feel like it was appropriate to revisit them, or feel anxious around the fact that they didn't work so well the last time. I'd really encourage you to think about what they look like. Think about how you can set them up differently. Do you need to use something a little bit outside of the box? Do you need to have a dice that's got strategies and ideas on each side of the dice, and they can just roll the dice for what they need to collect to take out with them, so that it's a more novel way of setting our children up to successfully accommodate their own needs, to successfully coach themselves in being able to access and participate and feel included, to be one of those peers that actually really is confident in the way in which they interact with each other, with their peers, because they know themselves, they understand themselves. And then we talked about how can we set up for success by thinking about changing our communication. Can we do that with those thumbs up stickers? Can we use those slogan suites? Can we make a cookie of some sort? Can we perhaps have a think about the way we use our words, using that more declarative way of saying something? Oh, I've noticed that. Just generally sort of making that, putting that out there, putting that information out there. And then also when we put that information out there, thinking about how our body language is working. You know, here we are saying, oh, our children are great at picking up on detail and remembering that. Well, that goes for our body language too. And when we've talked in terms before of our body language being at least 70+% of our communication, then if our children are picking up on that tension in our neck, or that tightening jawline, or those slanting eyes, because really we are frustrated and we are trying to move things on at speed, then actually that in itself can be a barrier for our children in succeeding, in moving forwards, in achieving what it is that we're asking. So thinking in terms of like, do I need to take a breath? Do I need to just stop myself a moment? Do I need to do that breathing just for a moment, so that when I speak to my child, or when I use that declarative way, that I'm declaring in a gentle, accessible tone, with a body language that doesn't actually contradict the words I'm trying to say, that actually has got that relaxed, comfortable, open look about it. Because when our children focus on that detail, then they too can read all of that and often can pick up on those sort of tensions that we're carrying around. So really try and think about how we can change our communication, because that too will set our children up for success. It will help them to be more accommodating in the requests that we're making, and it will help them to access communication in a more comfortable way, so that then hopefully they will start to initiate communication rather than just be responsive in their communication skills. Because we want our children to share their experiences. We want them to be the ones that are initiating those kinds of interactions, because that too sets them up for that long-term success. And then we've talked about strategies. We've talked about how we can build on those strengths, how we can build on those skills and use those strategies. So if our children are very tactile, are there more tactile ways that we can, you know, use visuals to support our children? You know, the class rules was that Mr. Potato Man game. Oh, you know, are there bits of games that we could use? Everything doesn't have to be in, you know, 1D or 2D. We can even use 3D ways of working. I've had great success in the past of using, you know, drawstring bags with lucky dip things that come out, maybe your comb or your toothbrush, in terms of deciding what we're going to do next to get ready in the morning. Or maybe a toy car and, you know, a piece of doll's clothing to decide what activity we're going to do or what things we might play. And certainly in terms of successfully moving on, and of course transitions is a whole new webinar for which we've done some, and I'm sure we'll be doing more. But actually it's part of success is being able to start and finish, and that whole sort of start and finish and wait, these more sort of ambiguous experiences sometimes are also helped by having planned ahead. So perhaps to set up our children successfully for moving on from being on their Roblox or their computer game, is to have that bag of what we might play next actually next to them, so that when that time is up and the computer's closed down, the game's finished, they know what they're going to be moving on to next, because they've made that plan in advance, which of course will help with that whole changeover and accommodate them by using their skills and strengths, by tuning in to the sorts of ways in which we can set our children up to cope with those changes. So I hope that some things touched your heart and mind during our webinar this morning, and that you've got something hopefully just churning away at those cogs to help you to have ways of reminding your child that they're such a smart cookie. And that is the absolute best way of sowing that seed to success, and to help them to be accommodating and also willing to take on some self-coaching, take on the things that they know that will help them to enjoy their day even more. So thank you for tuning in, and I hope if you've not been able to see all the slides today, because you're probably thick in the melee of school holidays, it might be a little bit later on in the term when you're at a point where you can just do a little bit of reflecting. And if you do, and there's anything that I've mentioned this morning that actually you're finding hard to adapt for your particular situation, then as always, my email is there on that slide, and you're very welcome to make any contact at all. So thank you.
That was brilliant. Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. We've had a few questions coming in. So the first one is,
great.
My son is almost 9 and newly diagnosed with ADHD and autism. He has a repetitive behaviour of turning light switches on and off again, 3 clicks. It's the same with most button, pull cords, doorbells, and even doors. He opens it, closes it, opens it again. He says it's a habit and he can't stop it, but it does drive me a little bit crazy. Have you got any tips for helping to stop this?
I think the important thing there is to try and just work out, is he doing it because he likes the click sound? Is he doing it because he likes the feel of it, the feel of the switch going up and down, or the control of the light going on and off? And I can understand that it drives you balmy. Lots of these little sort of repetitive behaviours can be very calming for our children. So it's a good idea not to stop them, but it's a good idea also to kind of reroute them, redirect them, so that they still get that satisfaction, so they're still getting that repetition and that calming behaviour, that calming feeling, but through a different means. So the different means could be something depending on what you work out. So if it's because of the light and the control, then sometimes hanging a little torch next to the light switch, just on a little plastic hook, one of those little tiny click-on, click-off torches, and redirecting him towards a little torch could be a good idea. Or if you've got someone creative in the family, or you yourself could just get a board and put on some switches and clicks and pulls on the board, and have that sort of close by, or mobile, so that you can move it around to just redirect that particular interest. Because then what we're doing is we're accommodating and coaching, because we're accommodating the need, we're understanding the need, but then we're also coaching where that can be appropriately directed. Because of course, we can't be going in to the airport and doing that with all the switches and light poles that we see. So it's really important and really valuable to start and work on these sorts of more appropriate ways of coping from as younger age as we can. So I hope that's helpful, and you get the idea that I'm not saying stop it and don't let him do it. I'm saying let's look at how we can support the need for that, but in a helpful way that's not going to drive the family balmy.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Next question is, how can we help autistic teenagers cope with the pressure of exams when their predictions from school are not positive, managing when they feel stuck and like a failure, getting through tough times when he has low self-esteem and he's very self-critical?
And I think this self-criticism for many of our children is really not, sadly, not uncommon. And I think some of it is rooted in the fact that they tend to often pendulate. So unless they're really, really, it's that perfectionism really. It's back to what Brené Brown talks about as that kind of addiction almost of perfectionism, that there's no grey area for many of our children. They live in the here and now, and what is happening right now is the experience that they're having. So I think, again, gathering lots of evidence, you know, demonstrating when our teenagers have had a successful piece of work or a successful assignment, and having that there to draw on, using lots of examples of other autistic teenagers that have achieved. And, you know, we can really just access them online, and there's also lots of reading material which I can't just bring to mind now, but if you want to pop me an email, I can certainly point you in the direction of some. But also, you know, helping our kids to really appreciate that other teenagers also have these anxieties, and other teenagers have these worries. I was just linked up a couple of young ladies recently, and both in their mid-20s, and it was just such a revelation hearing the slightly older young lady supporting the younger one in saying that, you know, she used to feel like that. She used to panic and do all night sitting up doing studies, because she left her studies to the very last minute, and then she'd be having to sort of panic work. And of course, some people do work better under stress and under that pressure. So it's about helping our teenager to understand how they work best. And if they get anxious under that stress and that pressure, then going back to one of those systems like I mentioned earlier, where actually on a planner, we've got everything out there. And I would again be cautious of using perhaps a yearly planner or a monthly planner if you've got the kind of young person that can just cope with knowing what's coming that day or that week. So having those assignments, those deadlines, when they're set, and that countdown up there, and using some kind of color coding system. So making it as simple and visually easy as we can. And I don't mean lists, because reading and processing spoken language call on sort of similar areas of the brain, whereas visual recognition calls on a more calming element of the brain. So being able to just look at something and see it can be really helpful. I myself, with my own profile, find that actually when even I'm doing notes for a presentation such as this, I will draw myself lots of little pictures as a reminder. So I might just have a little pair of binoculars or a tree or something like that to remind me, to prompt me to share a particular story about a particular experience. So because just glancing at that rather than having to read even one word is actually drawing on different areas of our brain. So I would say really try and focus in on how he studies best and what's the most calming way of working towards achieving handing things in, and putting up aside, you know, writing up what he's good at and having it there visually to glance at.